Sorry.
Anyways, I'll translate our conversations every time. Maybe it's questions, it's answer for my questions, and I'll translate it to Indonesian language.
That's so cool. I wish I spoke it. That's so cool. So do you want me to say a short part of an answer and then pause and let you translate like one or two sentences?
No, you don't have to do that. Just let it flow. Yeah, I'll try to translate it as brief as I could.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so I greet the participant first in bahasa in Indonesian language. Jadi selamat pagi semuanya. Hari ini kita ada kedatangan Dr. Liz. Dr. Liz ini dari Ryerson University di Toronto di Kanada. Beliau itu punya minat riset di bidang filsafat agama dan juga di bidang epistemologi. Nah, hari ini kita bakal ngomongin soal Pascal wager atau pertaruhan Pascal, yang mana pertaruhan Pascal tuh singkatnya begini ya, adalah sebuah bisa dibilang argumentasi gitu ya bagi kepercayaan kepada Tuhan. Kasarnya begini, menjadi teis adalah lebih menguntungkan gitu dibandingkan menjadi ateis karena let's say ada Tuhan gitu ya, ateis akan berakhir ke neraka dan lain cerita. Kalau misalnya ada Tuhan, ya ateis dan teis nggak ada masalah apa-apa. Nah, singkatnya begitu ya. Tapi nanti kita akan lihat bahwa di sini Dr. Liz akan coba punya versi yang lebih sophisticated lagi nih Pascal wager-nya. Jadi kita akan diskusikan hari ini, gunakan kolom komentar untuk memberikan pertanyaan, dan kalau ada tanggapan segala macam silahkan gunakan dengan bebas. So thank you Les for coming here. It's really a pleasure for us to have you and to talk about Pascal's wager.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here and for our discussion today.
Yeah. Could you share a bit about yourself? What are you doing? And so on.
Yes, definitely. So I teach philosophy at Ryerson University. You might have said this, but I didn't fully understand everything that you said, obviously. So I teach philosophy at Ryerson University. So I've actually only taught here for almost a year. So I started in July 2020. And before I was at Ryerson, I was a postdoc at Australian National University. So I actually got to live in Australia for a year, which was very fun. And then before that, I did my PhD in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, which is in Indiana in the United States. And I think you sort of said this already too, maybe, but my main philosophical research is in epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and rational belief, and then also philosophy of religion. So I'm very interested in the rationality of religious commitment, including religious belief as well, and also faith and Pascal's wager.
Yeah. So yeah, and we'll talk about before we talk about Pascal wager, to talk about our discussions, I want to inform you a bit about Scholia ID, our philosophy hub. So what is Scholia ID? I could say Scholia ID is a philosophy hub. We try to provide an accessible philosophy courses for laymen. I could say a public philosophy, and we organize weekly philosophy courses. We write daily articles, and we do weekly discussions for free in hope to increase the public criticisms here in Indonesia. We invite global and local philosophers for our weekly discussions. Some of them are William Lane Craig, Graham Oppy. We have Philip Goff, also Herdy Sandi from Indonesia, Yuji Nagasawa, and some others global and local philosophers. I could say we are the first philosophy hub to have the initiative to invite global philosophers to talk for Indonesia audiences, and you'll be one from many global philosophers which we will have discussions today. So once again, thank you, Dr. Liz. Let's talk right now about the Pascal's wager. I'll go to the first questions.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, so
that's awesome.
Before we discuss Pascal's wager, we always ask the first questions to every interviewee here. What philosophy is, and second, how could they and also you first introduce to philosophy? and later indulge in academic philosophy. I wonder about your opinion on those three questions.
Yeah, definitely. So defining philosophy is a very controversial philosophical question. Many philosophers don't agree on the definition. So I'll tell you the definition that I often give my students, but it's not a perfect definition. It's kind of a rough definition. But the definition I give my students is that philosophy is the study of fundamental a priori phenomena. So maybe I can explain a little bit. So a priori is things that you can learn about just by thinking about them. So one example, math is a priori. You can kind of see that 2 + 2 = 4 just by thinking about it. But science is not a priori. You have to go and do an experiment. You have to go study the world and look at the way that the world is. So this is a controversial definition, and I don't necessarily think all philosophy is always a priori, but I think in most cases, philosophy is normally a priori. So some of the examples of big philosophical questions is, what is the nature of the world? Does God exist? Do we have free will? What are the grounds of human knowledge? What is it to know? And how much can we know? That's epistemology, which is what I focus on. And then there's also evaluating human conduct. So what is right and what is wrong? What grounds morality, but also what is rational, what is irrational. So you can talk about morality and rationality. Those are different ways that we can evaluate human conduct. So that's maybe a rough definition of philosophy and some examples of some philosophical questions. Do you want me to keep going, or do you want to translate?
I'll translate it first, maybe.
Okay, yeah. Perfect.
Jadi teman-teman, apa sih filsafat itu? Buat Dr. Blaise, filsafat itu sebenarnya adalah sebuah studi terhadap yang namanya hal-hal yang sifatnya a priori, yang fundamental. Gitu. Apa itu a priori? Yang a priori itu adalah satu hal yang mana kamu nggak memerlukan usaha empirik gitu ya dalam memikirkannya gitu. Bisa dibilang kamu cukup berpikir mengenainya dan kamu nggak perlu melakukan observasi terhadapnya. Nah, jadi yang dipelajari sama filsafat umumnya itu, misalnya soal baik dan buruk, ya soal mungkin salah satunya keberadaan Tuhan, rasionalitas dan segala macam gitu ya. Jadi itu yang namanya filsafat gitu ya. Dan banyak perdebatan gitu. Tapi anyway, ini salah satu yang dipercaya sama Dr. Liz. So, Liz, you could just continue your answers.
Yeah. So I guess maybe a little bit about what got me into philosophy and then my specific philosophical interests. So what I actually got interested in philosophy through thinking about theology and religion. So I was in college and I was actually taking classes in theology and classes on religion, and I enjoyed them. I thought they were very interesting, but there was something missing for me. I wanted to go deeper. I wanted to question more of the assumptions. I think sometimes the teachers got frustrated with me because I would say why and challenge them a lot. And so I remember in college, I took my very first philosophy class. I didn't know what I was going to major in, but I was like, maybe I'll try out philosophy. And I didn't really understand what philosophy even was at the time. I just thought it sounds like it could be cool. And so I remember just being in that class and just thinking like, this is what I've been interested in my whole life. Like, these are my people. This is so great. I just loved it. And it was moral and political philosophy. So it actually wasn't even in my main area of interest, but I loved philosophy, and I loved the rigor of arguments and how you can really question any assumption. And I just really liked the way that philosophers thought. I think I grew up thinking that way quite a bit. So that's kind of what got me into philosophy. And so I sort of was pretty naturally interested in philosophy of religion because I do have a religious background as well. And so I kind of came into philosophy through theology and through religion. And so it was sort of natural for me, I think, to be interested in philosophy of religion, and it ended up being one of the main areas that I specialize in. So I've always been very interested in philosophy of religion. But I think I've also always been interested in questions about, what beliefs should we form and how can we be rational? And while epistemology is the study of knowledge, a lot of people think that rational belief is a part of knowledge, or at least an important aspect of epistemology. And so I also think, too, I was very interested in faith, the relationship between faith and reason and evidence. And that's also it's natural to see that as a question in epistemology as well. So I think that's kind of how I ended up focusing on those two main areas, epistemology and philosophy of religion.
Yeah, interesting. So I could say it's all start from one of the reason is I think a bit because of your religious background and your interest in theology.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I see. Do you still remember the first book you ever read in philosophy?
That's a really good question. The first book I ever read. This isn't the first book I ever read, but one of the first books I read was Plantinga, Warranted Christian Belief. I remember reading that very distinctly and not understanding a lot of it, but I was definitely very interested. I enjoyed reading it a lot. So that was one of the first, not the first, but one of the first.
Yeah, I see. It was my undergraduate thesis. I read about Plantinga for your information. Please let me translate, Dr. Les.
Yes,
ya,
go ahead.
Jadi teman-teman, kenapa bisa tertarik sama filsafat sih, Dr. Les? Salah satunya itu dia di college atau di waktu kuliah ya. Mungkin dia kalau bedaan sama Indonesia ya, bisa pilih-pilih major lah gitu. Nah, dia ambil filsafat secara tidak sengaja gitu. Karena dia tertarik sama teologi gitu. Jadi sebenarnya minatnya pertama sama teologi, terus belajar filsafat, topiknya moral sama politik. Nah, dari situ akhirnya mulai tertarik banyak sama filsafat dan sepenuhnya major neliti di sana. Tadi ya background-nya teologi, gitu. Jadi pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang sifatnya filsafat agama atau filsafat ketuhanan lah kalau di sini. Dan kemudian dilanjutkan juga hubungannya sama iman. Itu dia tertarik sama pertanyaan mengenai iman kan. Nah, pertanyaan mengenai iman itu pertanyaan juga soal kepercayaan dan juga rational belief atau kepercayaan yang rasional. Nah, jadi balik ke epistemologi, itu soal apa sih pengetahuan itu. Jadi akhirnya ke epistemologi dan juga filsafat agama. Okay, thank you. I'll go to the second questions. I wonder about we'll talk about Pascal's wager. Maybe first I want to know what kind of God that Pascal tries to prove. Is it only a kind of monotheistic God, or even more specific to Christian's God, or maybe it could be applied for other types of theistic beliefs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think just maybe I'll say something about historical stuff first. But as a historical matter, so Pascal, who wrote, the main argument, pioneered the argument we're talking about today, he was a Christian. He was actually a Catholic Janist. Jainists are kind of similar to Calvinists. So he believed in predestination, kind of interesting. That wasn't necessarily a very essential part of the wager, but just kind of interesting historically. However, when he is putting forth the wager, I think it's important to realize that he thought, this is very controversial, but he gave arguments that really there's two main worldview options. Either Christianity is true or atheism is true. So it's really one of those two options. And he thought they were roughly 50-50. So he thought it's a roughly 50% chance Christianity, roughly 50% atheism. And those are really the only two live options. Of course, there's multiple interpretations of him. Some people give a slightly different interpretation, but I think something along these lines is probably accurate. Those are the two main live options he was considering. And so I think it's really important. A lot of people don't realize that Pascal was sort of starting with that framework and gave arguments for that position before he goes into Pascal's wager. But, given that setup, he was trying to give an argument that you should, believe in or commit to the Christian God specifically, because for him, that was, if a religion was true, it was going to be Christianity.
Okay. I'll translate it, Liz. Jadi teman-teman, pertanyaanku itu soal Tuhan macam apa sih yang didiskusikan sama Pascal. Apakah Tuhan monoteistik, Tuhan Kristen, atau bisa bentuk Tuhan-Tuhan yang lain. Nah, perlu kita lihat secara historis konteksnya bahwa pada saat itu Pascal adalah seorang Kristen, ya cenderung semacam Calvinis, dia percaya predestinasi, bla 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 dan segala macam. Nah, jadi pada saat itu Pascal itu cuma tahu atau menawarkan dua pilihan ya, atau kamu ateis atau kamu jadi seorang Kristen. Nah, jadi pada saat itu dia sedang menawarkan argumen ini ya, pertaruhan ini di dalam konteks seperti itu. Nah, jadi bisa dibilang pada mulanya ini adalah soal perkara Tuhan yang monoteistik gitu loh. Nah, mungkin nanti kita bisa tanya lebih lanjut apakah bisa diaplikasikan ke bentuk lainnya. Gitu nanti kita diskusikan ya. So, Liz, I wonder why when I look at your profile, I could see that you already wrote two writings about Pascal, and one of it is which I read, Salvaging Pascal's Wager. And when I watch on a YouTube video, you also wrote your third writing on Pascal's. I wonder what makes Pascal for you so interesting, and you want to write about him. What's so special about Pascal's Wager?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And so I think there's a couple things I want to say in response. The first thing, I think, it's an argument that a lot of people just say it fails right off the bat. They even say it's stupid. I couldn't believe anyone would ever make this argument. It gets a lot of hate. People hate on it quite a bit. And I think, to the contrary, excuse me, it's actually one of the stronger arguments for the existence of God. So, I'm not saying there are objections to it that I think are very challenging. I'm not saying that that's not true. Of course, there are very challenging objections, but there are to every argument. And I think a lot of people just dismiss it so quickly, but actually, there's a very interesting argument that's worth a lot more time. You can't just dismiss it so quickly. So that's one reason. Another reason, though, that I think sets Pascal's wager apart from these other arguments. So many of the arguments for God's existence, so there's the cosmological argument, there's the ontological argument, there's the fine-tuning argument, all these arguments, right? Their conclusion is that God exists. So it's a conclusion about the world. They're giving evidence that God exists. Pascal's wager, it's different. The conclusion is not God exists. But the conclusion is there's basically two main versions of it. One would say you should believe in God, and then one would say you should commit to God. And what's interesting about this, it's a different claim because it's not giving evidence that God exists. It's saying this is something you should do. But what's really interesting, in some ways, it's actually even a stronger claim. It's not just saying there's a God, God exists. It's saying this is something you should do. You should make a lifestyle change. It's a prescription, and that's another reason I think it's really interesting. I think a lot of people think, oh, it's not giving evidence, so it's just this weird other thing. But no, it's actually in some ways doing something even more than giving evidence. It's saying you should act in this certain way. So that's another reason I find it very interesting. And then the final reason is just because I actually think it has a very important relationship to faith and what it is to continue. It can tell us about how we can continue in a commitment to God, even when we're encountering a lot of doubt. And like I mentioned before, I'm also interested in faith. So I guess to summarize, three reasons. One is because people dismiss it so quickly and they say it's a terrible argument, and I just don't think it is. Two is because it makes this different but stronger claim about what we should do. And then three is because it has this relationship to faith, which I'm also interested in.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So counterintuitively, for some people, Pascal wager is a stronger, you could have a more stronger, how could I say it? A stronger claim and a stronger
conclusion.
I could say some kind of imperative, a stronger conclusion and some kind of imperative that you could do X, Y, Z, blah blah blah. Okay, I'll translate it, Dr. Liz. Okay. Jadi kenapa sih bahas Pascal wager atau pertaruhan Pascal ini? Ada 3 hal menarik, teman-teman. Yang pertama, Pascal ini seringkali salah dimengerti, gitu ya. Jadi orang-orang kayak baca Pascal wager atau pertaruhan Pascal tuh kayak udahlah ini hal yang bodoh gitu. Kita nggak perlu lagi diskusikan hal ini pasti salah, bla 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 segala macam. Tapi padahal ini argumen yang sangat menarik. Karena yang kedua, gitu ya, dibandingkan sama argumen-argumen lainnya, misalnya tadi ya, argumen kosmologis, mari kita diskusikan, argumen ontologis, waktu sama Jude dan Gesawa, kan mereka cuma klaim bahwa Tuhan ada. Pascal Wager itu klaimnya lebih kuat, gitu ya. Klaimnya itu adalah bahwa kamu harus mengkomitmenkan dirimu terhadap Tuhan. Nah itu kan klaim yang lebih kuat. Kamu harus mengubah cara hidupmu dan segala macam. Nah ini poin yang menarik ya. Dan yang ketiga karena dia tertarik sama problem iman atau diskusi soal iman. Jadi 3 hal itu yang pada akhirnya membuat dia tertarik sama Pascal Wager. So who is this Pascal, and could you elaborate what is Pascal's wager?
Yeah, definitely. So I mentioned a little before, but Pascal was a French mathematician, very, very smart. He was arguably a child prodigy. And a lot of people attribute contemporary decision theory, which is a big part of philosophy and economics, to Pascal, or at least he pioneered the way for much of contemporary decision theory. So very, very smart guy. And here's a very basic version of the wager, which I'll say just so we can kind of all be on the same page with the simplest version of the argument. But then I'll also note, and like we already talked about a little bit, even Pascal's version was slightly different, slightly more nuanced than this. So we can talk more about some specific versions as well. But here's the basic version. So Pascal's wager says, look, there's 2 possible ways that the world could be. Either God exists or God does not exist. And then there's 2 options, 2 things you could do. You could believe in God or commit to God, or you could not believe in God, not commit to God. And then the thought is, well, if you believe in God and God exists, it's very good. You could go to heaven. You could have a relationship with God. It would be a very valuable thing, maybe even infinitely valuable. If you don't believe in God and God exists, then, you know, it could be a very bad thing. It could be infinitely bad. If there's a hell, you could be annihilated. But it's probably a worse state of affairs. And then if God does not exist, then, you know, you could believe in God, you could not believe in God. There could be different gains or losses associated with either of those, but it looks like they're going to be finite. It looks like whatever you would gain or lose if God does not exist, it's going to be a finite gain or a finite loss. And so the thought is, well, it looks like you should believe in God. You have a lot to gain if you believe in God and God exists. You have a lot to lose if you don't believe in God and God exists. And if God doesn't exist, then either way, it doesn't matter because it's finite. There could still be gains and losses, but they're finite. And so as long as there's some chance that God exists, even if it's a really small chance, decision theory is going to tell you that you should believe in God. So like I said, this is a very simplistic version of the wager. I just put it in terms of God. I didn't talk about a specific religion. Pascal had basically thought he ruled out all religions besides Christianity. So his version was Christianity is true, atheism is true. I can commit to the Christian God or believe in it or not commit, not believe. So, you know, that's one way of going. My way of going, what I actually do, a co-author and I in the paper you were mentioning, we say, here's a way you can actually use Pascal's wager to make a decision between a lot of different religions. So we don't make it about a specific religion, but we just consider the possibility that a lot of different religions are true in our decision making. And the main upshot of what we argue is that it's rational to practice a religion, and in most cases that's going to be the religion that has the highest probability. So like I said, there's different versions of the wager, but that is kind of the most basic and simple one.
Please let me translate it to the participants. Jadi aku nanya ya, siapa itu Pascal dan apa itu Pascal wager atau pertaruhan Pascal. Pascal ini teman-teman tahu ya, kayak temu di fisika juga ada si Pascal ini, Blaise Pascal, dan juga di matematika. Ini seorang matematikawan asal Prancis, seorang jenius, seorang anak-anak yang dari kecil tuh udah pinter lah gitu ya, nggak kayak saya misalnya gitu. Nah, si Pascal ini dia membuat sebuah argumen ya yang namanya pertaruhan Pascal. Apa sih pertaruhan Pascal? Tadi saya ada sempat mention. Pertaruhan Pascal ini adalah soal gini. Andaikan ada 2 kemungkinan bagi kenyataan dari dunia ini. Kemungkinan pertama adalah ada yang ateisme itu benar, atau ateisme benar, gitu ya, bahwa dunia ini diciptakan Tuhan, atau dunia ini tidak diciptakan Tuhan, gitu kan. Nah, kita sebagai manusia itu harus memutuskan kira-kira kita percaya yang mana nih, apakah saya menjadi ateis atau saya menjadi teis, gitu kan. Nah, Pascal itu mencoba untuk memberikan suatu teori putusan, gitu ya, decision theory. Kira-kira mana yang lebih baik atau yang lebih rasional, apakah untuk menjadi ateis atau menjadi teis, gitu ya. Nah, kalau kita coba lihat, kalian bisa cari diagramnya. Setelah dipikir-pikir, gitu ya, setelah direnungkan, setelah coba dihitung-hitung, yang paling masuk akal sebenarnya menurut Pascal adalah untuk mempercayai keberadaan dan keberadaan Tuhan. Kenapa? Karena dengan mempercayai Tuhan, kita punya kemungkinan yang paling baik untuk pertama terbebas daripada penderitaan yang sifatnya kekal, gitu, infinite, dan yang kedua juga kita memperoleh kepuasan yang sifatnya kekal, gitu loh. Sedangkan kalau misalnya kalian jadi ateis, gitu ya, even gini, ateis dan teis, kalau Tuhan nggak ada yang untung, nggak ada yang rugi. Tapi kalau Tuhan ada, teis, ateis rugi banget, sedangkan teis itu sangat beruntung. Nah, sebenarnya itu versi sederhananya. Blaise itu bahas versi lebih kompleks, lebih sophisticated, bisa aku bilang gitu. Nah, ntar kita akan coba gali terus gimana versinya dari Dr. Blaise ini. I'll continue to the next questions, Blaise. So yeah, Pascal's offers some kind of wager regarding belief in God. But are there any other philosophers who ever talk about this kind of wager, or Pascal is the first? And do you think, do any other philosophers still talk about this other than you? Because I hear, just like what you said, a lot of people think that Pascal wager sounds fishy. It's a pragmatic approach. It's irrational, a leap in the dark, egoistic, etc.
Sorry, I had to unmute my mic. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So the first thing that I think a lot of people don't know, but Al-Ghazali was a big figure in medieval Islamic scholasticism, lived before Pascal. This is actually also the place where your listeners are familiar with the Kalam cosmological argument, which is a famous argument for God's existence, also originates with medieval Islamic scholasticism. But Al-Ghazali actually proposed a version of the wager before Pascal. So Pascal often gets the credit for it, but arguably we should be giving Al-Ghazali some credit too. So that's one thing we mentioned briefly in the paper. I'm not an Al-Ghazali scholar, but I do think it's worth saying that because he did propose something very similar to the wager before Pascal did. In terms of like philosophers and whether they take it seriously. So yeah, I think definitely. Of course, like any argument, any argument in philosophy, people are going to disagree about it. And some are going to think it's good and some are going to think it's bad. But I think most philosophers think it's worth taking the wager seriously. And they're not just going to say, oh, what about all these religions? It must fail, just kind of give some kind of basic objection and then just, you know what I mean? Just say, it's not even worth thinking about anymore. And I think they realize that there is like a nuance here, and this involves interesting questions about religion and theology and decision theory and risk. And, so philosophers take the argument much more seriously than people online do. And I know a lot of philosophers that think it's a successful or a good argument. Again, not all, of course. And, a number of philosophers I'm sure don't. I know some that don't, but I know a lot of philosophers that think it is a successful argument. So I think that's worth noting too. I think a lot of times people make assumptions about philosophical arguments, but aren't actually looking at what the philosophers are saying. And I think it's worth noting too that, I'm not the first philosopher to defend it in published work. There's been a number of books and papers written about Pascal's wager. I have a whole bibliography written up of dozens of articles defending the wager. Two names I'll mention really briefly. Mike Rhoda has a book. It's called Taking Pascal's Wager. And it's a really great book, and it doesn't require a lot of really intense philosophical background. So if you're newer to philosophy, it's a good it's a more introductory book, but it's really good. Another person who's done a lot of research and defended the wager is Jeff Jordan. So he has, I think, 2 books on Pascal's wager, a little bit earlier than Mike's, but I wish I should have written the names down. But if you look up Jeff Jordan, Pascal's Wager, the books will come up. So those are two people off the top of my head that have defended, but a number of people have defended the wager. And then I want to say a little bit about what you said, or do you want to translate first and then I can answer the last part?
Yeah, maybe I'll translate it first.
It's too much. I know. I'm sorry. I'm talking a lot.
It's okay. Ya jadi aku translate nih teman-teman. Jadi apa namanya? Apa sih pertanyaanku jadi lupa ya pertanyaanku itu tadi apa ya pertanyaanku ya? Oh, siapa sih yang dulu pernah bahas Pascal Wager gitu ya sebelum Pascal? Ada filsuf yang namanya Al-Ghazali. Mungkin kalian juga pernah dengar ya. Al-Ghazali yang juga menawarkan kalam cosmological argument gitu ya, kalam argumen dari argumentasi kalam. Ini filsuf Islam yang besar teman-teman tahu. Jadi mungkin gak banyak orang tahu, tapi si Al-Ghazali ini salah satu filsuf yang bahkan bisa dibilang mendahului Pascal gitu ya. Nah, tadi aku juga nanya nih, apakah ada filsuf-filsuf yang menganggap Pascal ini secara serius? Tentu saja gitu ya, di dalam filsafat mungkin ada orang yang tidak setuju, ada yang setuju, tapi anyway perdebatan itu terus terjadi gitu ya. Dua tokoh yang tadi disebut, Mike Roda itu Taking Pascal Wager, teman-teman boleh cari. Sama yang kedua itu Jeff Jordan, itu juga dia bahas soal Pascal's Wager, Pragmatic Arguments and Belief in God kayaknya. Nah itu teman-teman bisa cari. Jadi dua buku itu yang bahas Pascal Wager, dan tadi yang Taking Pascal Wager katanya pengantar. Jadi kalau teman-teman pengen bahas Pascal Wager itu bisa bahas di sana. Nah sekarang aku bakal lanjut nih soal kritik-kritiknya gitu ya. Kritik-kritiknya tadi ya, Pascal Wager itu selfish, apa egois gitu ya. Terus apa namanya? Ini pendekatan yang pragmatis aja segala macam. Kita akan lanjut. Okay, please continue your answer.
Yes, so I wanted to address the last thing you said. So you said a lot of people think Pascal's Wager is fishy. Maybe it's irrational, it's a leap in the dark, it's egotistic. So I'll try to make it very brief. I just want to say one thing about those three things, that irrational, leap in the dark, and then egotistic. So first with irrational, Pascal's Wager is, it is taken to be a claim about what is practically rational. So what is rational to do sort of given your goals, right? But it's often criticized that it would lead to something that's epistemically irrational. So what's epistemically irrational, it means it's not supported by your evidence. So if I believe in God, just because, look, I can gain so much if God exists, and I'll lose so much if I don't believe in God, it doesn't seem like I'm believing because of evidence. I'm believing because of the gains or losses. So a lot of people will say this is irrational, at least epistemically irrational. So I think there's two things I want to say. The first is that sometimes our evidence is very complicated. Sometimes our evidence is hard to assess. And sometimes our evidence actually means that we could be rational to be a theist or an atheist or an agnostic. We could have any of those positions. And I actually think when it comes to God's existence, a lot of people's evidence might be like this. There's good arguments, interesting arguments for God's existence, but there's also good arguments against. The evidence is complicated. These debates have been going on for a very long time. And so maybe your evidence actually supports multiple positions. And so even if maybe you're an agnostic right now, you know that there is some arguments for God. You're aware of some evidence. So it would also be rational for you to be a theist. And the idea here is that the practical then is not telling you to go against your evidence. It's saying there's a tie. Both attitudes are good with your evidence. So the practical can break the tie. So that's one thing. I'm sorry, I'm going too slow. The other thing is for irrationality, some versions of Pascal's Wager, it's just about a commitment. It's just saying, make a commitment to God, go to church, read the Bible, be in a religious community, but it's not telling you what you should or shouldn't believe. And then it's not going to be epistemically irrational, because what's epistemically irrational is beliefs. It's not commitments. So if you make the wager about commitment, then it's also not epistemically irrational. Do you want me to say something about the other two, or is that too much? I'm sorry.
It's okay. Maybe we'll go to the two other statements in the next questions. But
Okay,
I'll
sure,
translate it first. Oke.
Good idea.
So jadi ini terkait irasionalitas teman-teman. Kan Pascal wager atau pertaruhan Pascal itu irasional. Gitu. Ada dua jawaban. Bukan ada dua jawaban ya. Ini terkait sama kenapa dianggap irasional? Karena dianggap ini irasional secara epistemis. Maksudnya gimana tuh irasional secara epistemis? Gini, pertaruhan Pascal ini kan bukan sebuah bukti ya. Ini kan nggak menunjukkan bukti nih Tuhan nih. Ini kan berbicara soal komitmen. Jadi mungkin aja orang punya kepercayaan mengenai Tuhan lewat pertaruhan Pascal, tapi dia nggak punya bukti-buktinya, ya nggak sih? Nah, itu yang membuat yang namanya Pascal wager dianggap secara epistemik rasional. Tapi gimana nih berarti soal bukti ini? Dan tadi cukup dijelasin panjang lebar ya. Soal bukti ini sebenarnya cukup kompleks gitu ya. Jadi ya itu nanti mungkin akan didiskusi lebih lanjut. Tapi begitu yang pertama. Yang kedua ini terkait sama komitmen gitu ya. Jadi pertaruhan Pascal ini cuma berbicara soal komitmen nih. Pergi ke gereja atau pergi ke masjid, gitu ya, berdoa, pergi ke komunitas religius dan segala macam. Ini bicara soal komitmen doang, gitu ya. Tapi bukan soal soal yang epistemik gitu. Nah, jadi ini sebenarnya ketidaksetujuan orang-orang sebagian besar terhadap Pascal yang dianggap irasional. Bisa aku bilang seperti itu. Nah, ntar kita lanjut nih soal kritik kepada Pascal wagers. So, list how many critics and what are there toward Pascal's wager?
I'm sorry, I tried to unmute myself and I turned my video off. Yeah, I want to mention two of the critiques you asked from the last question too, but maybe first what I'll do is I'll say in our paper, that one that you read, Samuel, called Salvaging Pascal's Wager, that paper, we answer a lot of critiques. So maybe I'll list them and then I'll talk about a couple. There's too many to talk about them all. Okay. Many gods objection, which says, what do we do about multiple religions? Mixed strategies objection, which says, the way that infinities work in decision theory is very weird. It leads to these weird results that are problematic. It's about infinities. The objection, what do we say about the fact that there seems like there could be an infinite number of religions? How do we deal with that? There's two objections related to each other. One we just talked about, but would be that Pascal's wager is epistemically irrational. But then there's also the worry that taking Pascal's wager is just impossible because you can't control your beliefs. So it's slightly different. It's not saying it's irrational, it's saying you can't do it at all. There's also the worry about hell. Would a loving God really send people to hell? And then how could Pascal's wager depend on this idea that there's hell? That just seems really counterintuitive. One we're going to talk about later, so I won't talk about that now. The Homer Simpson objection. We'll get to that in a second. There's also this thing called Pascal's mugging. So it's this thought experiment that's supposed to show that it's irrational to take Pascal's wager. Maybe I'll save that, but if people want to talk about it in the Q&A, we can. And then I'll just mention one more, which is temporal discounting. So that's the idea. What if I just don't care about the far future? What if I don't care about what happens to me in 2,000, 10,000, 100,000 years? What if I just don't care? And some economists think it's actually rational to care more about what's nearby than the really far future. And then there's one more that we talk about, which is transformative experience objection. So that was a lot. That was like maybe 10. So maybe I'll say a few things about some of these, but maybe this can also be if you were like, whoa, oh my goodness, go check out the paper. We talk about all this in the paper and answer all the objections in detail. So sorry if that was kind of a whirlwind. I want to mention though, the idea that Pascal's wager is like a leap in the dark. That's actually in some ways kind of related to the Pascal's mugging objection too. And so I want to say in response to that sometimes it is rational to take a risk. And it's rational to take a risk even if the thing you're taking a risk on has a low probability. So one example, I'm going to give two examples, but one is actually an example that Al-Ghazali gives, which I think is cool. But he gives an example. Let's say you're very sick. And maybe you've had a very painful sickness your whole life. So you're in a lot of pain, very, very sick. There's a medicine that, doctors can't figure out what's wrong with you. It's very puzzling to them. But this new medicine that has just come out, there's a small chance it could cure you, maybe like 5%, 10%, very small chance. And it's expensive. Maybe it costs several $1,000s. It could be rational for you to buy that medicine, even if there's just a small chance it would cure you, because of how good it would be if you could be cured from this illness you've had your whole life. So there's a small probability that it will cure you, and it's expensive, but it could still be rational for you to buy the medicine. So that's an example that's similar to one that Al-Ghazali talks about. Another example that I've given before, let's say your brother goes missing and you've been searching for him for weeks and weeks and weeks, and you can't find him. And the longer that he's gone, the less probable is that he's still alive. So maybe after 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, it's low probability that he's still alive. But it could be rational for you to keep searching for him and keep trying to find him, even though it's a low probability. In some ways, it is a leap in the dark to keep looking for him as the probability gets so low. But it would be so good to find your brother that it can be rational for you to continue to search for him. So do you want to translate that? And then maybe I'll say something about the egotistical thing.
Ya, oke. I'll translate it first. Thank you, Dr. Lulis. Jadi ini terkait soal ini ya, apa namanya sih tadi itu, soal lompatan gitu ya, lompatan iman. Gitu. Pascal Wager atau pertaruhan Pascal ini adalah sebuah lompatan ke dalam kegelapan. Gitu. Ini boleh nggak sih kayak gini? Bagi sebagian orang untuk mengambil sebuah keputusan yang menyebabkan risikonya tinggi bisa dianggap rasional loh. Jadi bukan selalu sifatnya rasional. Kenapa rasional? Tadi pakai contoh dari Al-Ghazali. Let's say pada suatu hari gitu ya, kamu sakit nih, ini contohnya Al-Ghazali. Kamu sakit parah dan kamu nemuin obat nih ya, obat yang punya probabilitas untuk nyembuhin kamu ya cuma sekitar 5-10%. Tapi harganya mahal banget. Mungkin ratusan juta. Nah, kalau begitu artinya kamu kan harus mengerjakan banyak hal lah gitu ya. Kamu sakit tapi kamu harus cari uang dan kamu harus tetap untuk beli obat tersebut supaya kamu bisa sembuh. Nah, dalam kondisi seperti itu adalah rasional bagi kita untuk tetap mencoba membeli atau mengkonsumsi obat tersebut gitu ya, supaya pada akhirnya kita bisa sembuh gitu kan, daripada nggak sama sekali. Dan yang kedua contoh, seandainya adik kamu hilang, gitu, kalaupun adik kamu hilang gitu ya, ada probabilitas kecil untuk menemukannya gitu ya, udah lama gitu. Apa yang kamu lakukan? Apakah kamu nggak akan cari waktu gitu untuk nyari adikmu tersebut? Enggak, tentu kamu akan tetap meresikokan dirimu untuk mencari adikmu sendiri. Nah, jadi kadangkali atau seringkali lompatan ke dalam hal yang gelap gitu atau menggunakan resiko itu juga bisa rasional dan patut untuk dilakukan. Okay, Liz, you can continue the answers.
Sorry, my answers are so long. I've never actually had a translator before, so it makes you realize how much you talk. So I wanted to say, maybe I'll say something about the egotistical thing, and then maybe briefly say something about the many gods objection, because a lot of people bring that up too. So the egotistical objection says, look, Pascal's wager, it's just selfish. Like all you're caring about is yourself and whether you go to heaven or whatever, or maybe you're just trying to avoid hell. It just seems like it's bad motives. It's not a good reason to believe in God or commit to God. So there's a couple things I wanted to say about this. The first is that there is a difference between being selfish and being self-interested. It's a very important distinction that philosophers make. So when you're selfish, what you do is you only prioritize yourself and you ignore other people. So there's a pizza, everyone's really hungry. You take the whole pizza for yourself and you ignore the fact that other people are hungry too. So you're kind of, putting your own interests up, but then putting theirs down, right? But self-interested is different. And all that self-interested means is that it's coincides with your goals. So brushing your teeth every day is self-interested. Eating healthy food is self-interested. Doing anything that relates to your goals is self-interested. And yes, it is about you and your goals, but it's not selfish. It's not a bad thing to do something just because it's something you want to do. I mean, that's like, what do we do all the time every day? It's like things we want to do, things that are based on what our goals are. So I think that's a really important distinction. I think Pascal's wager, even if it's self-interested, that doesn't automatically mean it's selfish. And then the other thing I want to mention about this as well, I think when I think about the ideal way to take Pascal's wager, the person says, look, I don't know that God exists. I don't even know if I believe that God exists. I have a lot of doubt. Maybe I just think there's a small chance that God exists. But if God did exist, it would be a very good thing to know God. God would be the highest good. God created me. God cares for me. And so it would be a very good thing to be able to be in a relationship with God. And that is the primary thing that motivates the person who's taking Pascal's wager, is this good of being in a relationship with God if God exists. In the same way, you're thinking, if my brother's still alive, how good it would be if I continued to try to find him. If this medicine could cure me, how good it would be if I pay some cost to get the medicine. It's similar to that. You're taking a risk, but there's a very good thing to be gained. So it's a rational risk. And I have a paper too, where what I try to argue is that this kind of mindset can actually really demonstrate genuine and rational faith that God exists. So I actually think taking Pascal's wager can be a way of demonstrating faith. I guess I'll say very briefly something about the many gods objection, and then maybe we can go to the next question. So the many gods objection is, how do we deal with all these different religions? What do we say about the fact that there's all these religions? And my co-author and I, in that paper, we basically say, look, you need to incorporate these different religions into your decision. So you need to think about the possibility that all these different religions are true, and that should be part of your decision when you're deciding how you should be taking Pascal's wager. And there are different factors at play here, but one of the big factors at play is going to be the probability of the religion. So I think in a lot of cases, what you should do is you should wager. So you should either believe or commit to the religion that you think is most likely to be true. So that's sort of how we get around the many gods objection. I know there's a lot of other objections I didn't mention, but we'll talk about a few more, and also feel free to check out the paper as well.
Okay, thank you, Liz. I'll translate it. Jadi ini terkait dua hal lainnya, bahwa Pascal wager itu selfish, dan yang kedua itu terkait many gods objection atau objection keberadaan dari Tuhan yang banyak. Yang pertama menjawab soal apakah Pascal wager ini selfish atau egois. Nah, kita perlu membedakan antara bersikap egois dan bersikap self interest gitu ya. Self interest ini apa ya, John? Enaknya translate-nya. Cuma anyway, selfish and self interest. Selfish itu egois, self interest itu memenuhi kebutuhan diri kali ya, John ya?
Iya, apa ya?
Semacam itu sih. Iya, semacam itu ya, self interest gitu.
Iya, iya.
Nah,
gitu. Keinginannya untuk diri sendiri.
Iya.
Kebaikan diri sendiri, keinginannya untuk memperbaiki diri sendiri.
Benar. Kebaikan. Benar. Nah, ya, thank you, John. Jadi itu ya, selfish, self interest. Nah, kalau selfish itu ya kita sikapnya egois, tau lah ya. Aku mau bertemanan sama dia karena aku mau dapat duit nih, itu kan selfish. Tapi self interest beda gitu ya. Kamu sikat gigi tiap hari, kamu tidur, kamu makan, kamu belajar, itu kamu sedang memenuhi self interest daripada dirimu sendiri. Nah, demikian juga Pascal wager itu nggak mengajarkanmu untuk jadi egois gitu, untuk jadi selfish, tapi untuk self interest gitu, untuk memenuhi kebutuhan dirimu sendiri. Jadi perlu dibedakan tuh antara selfish sama self interest. Ya, jadi tadi Lintang ngomong nih, ini kok kayak judi? Ya emang sebenarnya tanda kutip judi ya. Tapi ini bukan sifatnya selfish gitu. Yang itu soal selfish dan self interest gitu ya, soal egoisitas dan juga keinginan diri. Yang kedua itu soal many god objections, atau kan ada Tuhan ada banyak, bentuk-bentuk teisme itu ada banyak. Terus mana yang harus kupilih? Itu pertanyaannya menarik juga tuh. Kalau menurut Liz, ya kamu akhirnya harusnya bertaruh gitu ya. Kamu harus ngelis tuh agama apa aja, kamu list tuh. Agama ini, agama itu, agama ini, agama itu, mana yang paling masuk akal, evidence-nya paling gede gitu ya, dan juga yang paling helpful untuk memberikan kepada dirimu untuk nantinya kamu rasa hal yang paling masuk, yang paling pantas untuk kamu putuskan. Dan ini sekali lagi bukan soal egoisitas ya. Ini adalah cara supaya kita yang fokus itu kan bukan soal semata gue nggak masuk neraka nih, tapi gimana kita akhirnya berrelasi dengan Tuhan, katanya begitu. Sama seperti kalau misalnya kamu minum obat yang tadi aku sebut itu jadi sembuh, atau kayak misalnya ketika kamu ketemu adikmu, kamu kembali berrelasi dengannya. Nah, jadi kurang lebih seperti itu untuk pertanyaan yang ini. Nah, kita lanjut ke soal terus bagaimana memahami Pascal wager dengan lebih baik. I'll continue to the next questions. So, this question seems short, but actually it is what your paper about is. Can you share briefly about how should we better understand Pascal wager, or in your terms, salvaging it?
Okay, yes, definitely. So my paper, I kind of already answered this a little bit, but maybe I'll just say a little bit more. So my paper is basically trying to take Pascal's wager and then modify it in light of certain objections, so we can still use something like the wager in our decision making. And so like I said before, the main part of the paper, we answer two objections. The many gods objection, the one we already talked about, and then also the mixed strategies objection, which is the one that has to do with how we're using infinities in decision theory. But actually those two objections in some ways are actually pretty closely related. And we say that once you include various religions in your decision making, and then realize that we need to use decision theory to compare these religions, even though they offer infinite rewards and infinite punishments. Once we can kind of make decision theory work with that, both objections go away. So there's a technical problem there, but we don't actually think there's a substantial problem there. We think we just need to do the math a little bit better, basically, is our answer to those. And then after that, we go, and I think we probably address, I don't know exactly how many, but maybe 10 more objections to the wager. Some of them we've already talked about. One of them is the irrationality objection. So we addressed that one. I don't think we actually addressed the egotistical objection there, but this other paper that is called Faithfully Taking Pascal's Wager that I wrote, that's all about that objection. And then we address a number of other objections as well. And I think one of the big upshots maybe of the paper that I'll just mention is that probability matters, and the probability of these various religions does matter. And so in most cases, what's going to be rational for you to do is to wager on the religion that you think is most likely to be true. So we're not telling you which religion you should pick. That's not part of the goal of the paper. You know, like I said, Pascal tried to argue that Christianity is true or not true, but if a religion is true, it's going to be Christianity, right? We're not trying to do that. We're just trying to say, let's remain neutral on which religions might be true or false, and then tell you how to make a decision sort of given that framework, that setup. You could combine our paper with arguments that raise the probability of a certain religion and then get the result that you should wager on that religion, but that's not what we're doing in the paper.
Oke, please let me translate it. Jadi sebenarnya apa yang coba diargumentasikan sama Dr. Liz itu kan udah disampaikan ya, gimana cara bikin lebih baik. Tapi sederhananya ini ya, menjawab objection yang ada terhadap Pascal wagers. Ada tadi sebut ya, ada 10 kayaknya tuh. Nah itu cara untuk menjadikannya menjadi lebih baik lagi ya, dengan menjawab objeksi tersebut yang diperhadapkan kepada si pertaruhan pasal ini, ya, yang tadi many God objections, segala macam. Nah, yang perlu kita ketahui juga bahwa memang di dalam tulisannya Pascal itu berposisi gitu ya, Christian God gitu, Tuhan Christian gitu. Nah, tapi di dalam tulisannya Dr. Liz, teman-teman boleh cari ya, Salvaging Pascal Wager, cari aja. Itu dia nggak berposisi terhadap yang spesifik. Jadi sifatnya lebih general lah, bisa aku bilang. Nah, jadi lebih general, kalian bisa kombinasikan dengan bentuk-bentuk belief kalian sendiri, mungkin Islam atau segala macam. Nah, itu udah lain cerita, tapi bukan itu yang sedang diusahakan sama Dr. Liz di dalam tulisannya tersebut. Nah, jadi sekali lagi di dalam tulisannya tersebut gitu ya, atau cara membuat Pascal ini lebih baik argumennya adalah dengan menjawab objection terhadap Pascalnya itu sendiri. Tulisan itu sangat teknis teman-teman ya, jadi kayak tulisan matematika gitu ya. Nanti John ada sedikit komen juga. Itu tulisannya jadi nuansanya matematis gitu ya, teknis. Jadi menarik untuk kalian baca juga kalau menurutku. Gitu. Oke. Nah, kita lanjut ke pertanyaan terakhir nih ya, pertanyaan soal Homer Simpson. Gitu. Jadi Homer Simpson tuh pernah ngomentarin soal si Pascal ini. So I'll go to the last questions, the one that you also put in your paper about Homer Simpsons. Yeah, so Homer once critiqued Pascal's wager. He said that suppose we've chosen the wrong God. Every time we go to church, we're just making him madder and madder. Yeah. So I wonder, are there any technical terms for Homer's critic, and what do you think about it?
Yeah. Do you guys watch The Simpsons in Indonesia? Is that a thing people do?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you know Homer Simpson. Yeah. So it's funny that you asked if there's a technical name for it, because we did kind of make up this name for it. We just sort of threw the name the Homer Simpson objection because we thought it was funny. So yeah, I do think it's related to the many gods objection, right? Because it's saying, what if we picked the wrong God and then we made God mad by going to church? So, it's kind of like the many gods objection, but I do think it's slightly different. It's slightly more nuanced, because here's a way of maybe filling out the objection. So, let's say we could pick a religion, or, be an atheist or agnostic. If you think that God would be really, really mad if you picked a religion but picked the wrong one, but not that mad if you were just kind of neutral as an atheist or an agnostic, you didn't really practice any religion, then maybe if you picked the wrong religion, you would go to hell. But if you're just neutral, maybe you would just be annihilated, or maybe you would, maybe even go to heaven, And so it's supposed to say it's actually a safer bet to be an atheist or an agnostic than to practice the wrong religion. So that's why I think it's a little more specific than the many gods objection, because it's actually trying to explain how maybe atheism could be rational potentially. So again, I don't think there's a name for that specific objection in the literature besides the Homer Simpson objection, which I think is fun. So, it's like philosophy. It's like we all take ourselves so seriously that maybe we just need to make jokes sometimes. so that's our name for it. So I think there's a couple things to be said in response to this. The first thing we say is look, I did say before, in most cases, you should wager on the religion that you think is most likely to be true. But if you are totally 100% convinced that God is going to be much happier with you if you're an atheist or an agnostic than if you practice the wrong religion, this could be potentially an exception to that. And that's why it's not a perfect rule. It's just kind of a general rule of thumb that applies in most cases. But what we say in that case is, at least you're thinking about the afterlife in your decision making. And that's, in some ways, the most important thing we're trying to say in the paper is, here's a way that you can make decisions in light of potential things that could happen in the afterlife. And so it's a very concessive response, because it is saying maybe that is one case where it's rational to be an atheist, but you're considering the afterlife, and that's what's important to us. So that's very concessive. I think a less concessive response is to kind of challenge the idea that atheists and agnostics are neutral, and practicing the wrong religion is actually going to make God very mad. I think there is a lot of reason to question whether that is actually true. And here's one reason to question it. Many religions prescribe a lot of the same kind of actions. You should pray, you should help the poor, you should attend a religious service, you should tithe, give money to the church. And so arguably, even if you're practicing the wrong religion, you're still taking a lot of actions, you're still doing a lot of things that are prescribed by the true religion. And I think this is at least one reason to think that God would prefer that you worship a God, you practice some religion, even if it's not quite right, rather than just ignoring God altogether. So here's an analogy that we give in the paper. So let's say you have two children, and you invite them both to your 50th wedding anniversary. So it's a very big party, very big celebration. Your first child, comes to the party and brings you a gift that's not really exactly what you wanted, because they don't know exactly what you want. So they bring you a gift that's kind of weird. It's not exactly what you want, but they come to the party, they make an effort, they believe you exist. The second child totally ignores the invitation completely and says you don't exist. And then it's like, which is the better child? Of course, the first child got some stuff wrong. It's not ideal. They practice the wrong religion, but the other child says you don't exist and ignores you completely, you know? So I don't think it's not a perfect analogy, and it's not gonna, you know, establish that, you know, for sure it's always better, but to practice the wrong religion. But I do think it's like, it's not at all clear that atheists and agnostics are just neutral, and then those who practice religions are the ones that aren't. I think everyone's worshiping something, everyone's making something be the center of their life, and sometimes that's God and sometimes it's something else, you know. So I think there's reason to question Homer's deep theological statement here.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Yeah, it really interesting. I'll translate it. Jadi teman-teman, di dalam salah satu episode The Simpsons, Homer tuh jadi dia males si Marge Simpson tuh nyuruh Homer, ayo kita gereja gitu loh, kasarnya begitulah. Tapi si Homer nolak, nggak mau gitu kan. Gimana kalau misalnya Tuhan tuh bukan Tuhan yang kamu percaya nih, Marge, Tuhan Kristen, tapi Tuhan yang lain. Semakin sering saya ke gereja gitu ya, semakin nanti Tuhan marah sama saya gitu. Itu kan banyol tapi lucu gitu ya. Nah, anyway gitu ya, gimana kita meresponi hal tersebut gitu ya. Yang pertama, perlu diketahui bahwa ateisme dan agnostisisme itu bukanlah sebuah posisi yang netral, ya, melainkan justru adalah sebuah posisi juga. Ini poin pertama yang penting, gitu ya. Jadi ateisme dan agnostisisme bukanlah sebuah posisi yang netral, tapi adalah salah satu posisi juga, gitu ya. Jadi hal tersebut tidak menjadikan seorang ateis atau agnostik itu menjadi lebih baik dibandingkan orang-orang yang beragama. Nah, itu yang pertama. Lalu yang kedua, gitu ya. Ini menurut Liz adalah lebih baik, gitu ya, daripada kamu ateis sepenuhnya, kamu orang yang memperhatikan agama, gitu. Agama yang kamu anggap paling tepat. Kenapa? Let's say tadi ya, pakai analogi bahwa ada seorang kamu sebagai orang tua ulang tahun, gitu ya. Ada dua anak. Anak yang pertama itu bawain kamu hadiah. Meski begitu hadiah nggak sesuai keinginan kamu. Let's say kamu mau mobil, gitu ya. Anaknya itu bawain motor, gitu ya. Nggak sesuai, tapi ya kamu senang sama tersebut. Atau ada anak kedua yang bahkan nggak bawa hadiah dan menganggap bahwa kamu nggak ada, gitu ya. Ya pasti kamu akan bersikap secara lebih baik kepada anak yang pertama dibanding anak yang kedua, gitu loh. Nah, jadi dua hal tersebut yang bisa kita berikan tanggapan kepada si Homer-nya. Dan poinnya itu ya, ateisme dan agnostisisme bukan posisi netral, melainkan sebuah posisi yang juga sama seperti kalau kamu beragama. Itu poin yang penting dari diskusi soal si Homer Simpsons ini. Yeah, I guess that is my last questions. But I wonder, John, do you have any questions or response to Liz?
Yeah, well, I actually have a lot of responses. I would say maybe I can start with the my positive appreciation for Dr. Liz's paper, Solvaging Pascal's Wager, because I noticed that so maybe we didn't talk so much about it, but actually in your paper you presented Pascal's wager as an issue of decision theory, which I thought was interesting because you know, this is putting Pascal's wager in mathematical terms, where in finance and in economics you have what's called as a decision theory, and you have what's called an expected value, which is, you know, based on the probability and based on the outcome or the benefit of it. How likely are you to get benefit from the same decision, but with a low outcome? With a low probability or with a high probability. So like, if I give you $100, but then you only get 1% chance of getting it, it's not very huge expected value. And so I really appreciated that, because I study mathematics here in U of T, and of course you pointed out this in your paper as well. When Pascal's wager is put in mathematical terms, we have to do it infinities, because, you know, heaven and hell is infinite value or negative infinity disutility, or, you know, negative infinity pain, so to say. But it's really hard for us to actually put them in scientific terms like that, because infinity is not a number in mathematics. At least it does not work for us to multiply numbers to get expected value in Pascal's wager, because we have infinity. And yet this is what's happening in the literature. Like in the philosophical literature, it seems that people are obsessed in putting this in mathematical terms, whereas in mathematics, the first thing mathematicians will tell you is that this is quite frankly fallacious in mathematical terms, because infinity is not a number that you can use to multiply. And there's even an easy way to show how this is fallacious. which you actually talk about in your paper as well. It's like, hey, if I offer you to go to heaven, but you only get 0.0001% chance of actually going to heaven, or you can go to heaven for 99.9% chance, like which one do you prefer? Like, expected value wise, if you just count it and treat infinity as a number, clearly in both cases the expected value is infinity. But then again, it does not work, because clearly you will not choose the heaven where you only get that 0.0001%. And so then it seems that the original way, or the way that philosophers tried to put Pascal's wager in the contemporary or in analytic philosophy as a mathematical tool, or in economical model of decision theory, it seems fallacious. And I really appreciate that in your paper you point that out. And maybe I can try to explain this one first before I move on to more the concern that I have with the Pascal's wager, at least in the way that it's presented in your paper, Salvaging Pascal's Wager. Jadi mungkin aku terjemahin dulu ya, Sam ya. Tadi jadi sebenarnya yang luar biasa dari karya Dr. Liss itu, karena Dr. Liss itu menaruh Pascal's Wager atau pertaruhan Pascal ini bukan dalam formulasi mulanya oleh Blaise Pascal, tetapi dalam pertanyaan apakah kita mampu menaruh pertaruhan Pascal sebagai teori ekonomi atau teori matematika yang kita sebut decision theory. Jadi decision theory itu berhubungan dengan game theory juga, dan itu intinya ingin mencoba memperhitungkan rasionalitas kita untuk memilih suatu keputusan gitu. Dan caranya adalah probabilitas dikali dengan manfaat yang kamu dapat dari keputusan itu. Jadi kalau aku tawarin kamu mau 100, ini enggak 100.000 rupiah gitu. Tapi kamu cuma punya 1% untuk dapat, kesempatanmu cuma 1%. Probabilitas kamu mendapatkan itu cuma 1%. Nah, kalau kamu kali ya kamu cuma dapat $1 gitu kan. Jadi nggak $1, maksudnya intinya nomornya nominalnya lebih kecil daripada 100.000 gitu, karena persentase kamu mendapatkan itu sangat kecil gitu, sehingga mungkin tidak rasional untuk kamu mencoba mendapatkan $100.000 tersebut, karena kalau kamu hitungkan gitu probabilitas dan sebagainya dalam decision theory ini, yang disebut expected value gitu atau rasionalitas yang diharapkan itu sebenarnya sangat rendah gitu. Nah, yang menjadi masalah adalah dalam pertaruhan Pascal kita bukan berbicara tentang hal-hal yang manfaat dan kerugiannya itu memiliki angka yang bisa didefinisikan. Kalau misalnya dalam decision theory, dalam menghitung keputusan pemerintah, keputusan seorang individu, keputusan seorang perusahaan, pasti kerugian dan manfaatnya bisa dinilai. Gitu. Tapi dalam Pascal's Wager, gitu kan, pertaruhan Pascal, kita memiliki keputusan yang konsekuensinya surga atau neraka. Dalam arti kita berhadapan dengan yang disebut infinity, gitu kan, angka yang tidak terhingga, gitu. Nah, Dr. Liss gitu membicarakan bagaimana dalam diskusi kontemporer filsafat agama sekarang, karena ada sebuah obsesi untuk membuat ini sebagai masalah saintifik, mereka terlalu ingin menaruh dalam model ekonomi decision theory tersebut bahwa kalau misalnya kita punya manfaat yaitu nomor infinity untuk kamu percaya pada Tuhan dan pergi ke surga, maka nggak peduli probabilitasnya serendah apapun, kalau kamu kali dengan infinity akan tetap menjadi infinity gitu. Nah itu ya mungkin dalam filsafat itu sedikit bisa dimengerti, kita bisa mengerti maksudnya probabilitas sekecil apapun kalau dikali angka tidak terhingga itu pasti tetap tidak terhingga gitu kan. Jadi nggak apa-apa dong gitu. Kalau gitu kalau kita gunakan decision theory dalam ekonomi dan matematika, ini berarti expected value atau nilai harapan rasionalitas yang diharapkan tetap nilai tak terhingga gitu. Tapi yang dilupakan dalam oleh para filsuf yang menaruh masalah ini sebagai masalah decision theory, dalam matematika bilangan tidak terhingga atau infinity itu sebenarnya bukan bilangan. Jadi hal pertama yang ahli matematika akan balas gitu untuk masalah ini adalah bentar kamu nggak bisa bilang gitu, karena dalam matematika bilangan tak terhingga itu bukan bilangan yang bisa dikali atau digunakan sebagai seakan itu sebuah bilangan. Dan ini karena dalam matematika itu akan menciptakan situasi-situasi yang paradoksikal, kontradiktori, dan bahkan terkadang situasi yang tidak jelas gitu. Jadi contohnya kalau misalnya dalam kasus seperti ini, anggap saja benar gitu. Kalau misalnya angka tidak terhingga itu bisa dijadikan sebuah bilangan gitu. Aku bilang, kamu pergi ke surga, nggak peduli probabilitasnya apa, karena angka tidak terhingga dikali probabilitas kecil pun tidak apa-apa gitu. Tapi aku bilang, coba kalau aku tawarin kamu nih, dua agama yang berbeda, dua-duanya kamu bisa pergi ke surga. Tetapi agama yang satu, probabilitas kamu ke surganya cuma 1%. Satunya lagi, probabilitas kamu ke surga 99% gitu. Nah, kamu pilih yang mana? Kan dua-duanya surga. Jadi manfaat yang kamu dapat tak terhingga dong. Jadi kalau gitu, dua-duanya pilihan yang memiliki rasionalitas yang sama gitu. Nah, tentunya orang bilang, enggak dong, aku pasti pilih agama yang 99% gitu. Nah, tapi kenapa? Kalau misalnya kita gunakan decision theory tadi dan perhitungan para filsuf di dalam tabel ini, harusnya nomor tak terhingga dikali probabilitas apapun sama-sama tak terhingga dong. Jadi, what's problem? What's wrong? Gitu. Dua-duanya probabilitas yang sama. Nah, tapi Dr. Liz menggunakan papernya itu untuk bilang, loh, enggak gitu. Hanya karena kita mampu memiliki itu sebenarnya salah gitu, formulasi pertaruhan Pascal dalam diskusi kontemporer gitu yang menggunakan bilangan tak terhingga mentah-mentah itu salah gitu, karena itu mencangkup pemikiran pengajian bahwa bilangan tak terhingga itu dalam matematika bukan bilangan, dan itu masih perlu diperjelas lagi sebenarnya dalam matematika. And also, I guess I really appreciated just like a small point as well, how you overcame the problem of how infinity is is not a number in mathematics, at least, is that you use the limit. And I guess I'm just like saying how in mathematics as well, this is actually how we overcome the same problem as well, of how we can't define infinity, so we use the concept of a limit. And I guess apart from that, I do have one concern though that I think I want to bring regarding your paper as well, and this is about the use of the word probability. I think because I think in your paper you use two words that are interchangeable. You use them interchangeably, but I think they may not be interchangeable, and they may also even have very different implications to the argument depending on which word you use. And I think those two words are credence and probability, because I think you use these two words. You say the credence of believing in a particular religion affects whether or not the expected value for that religion is high or not. But on another occasion, you use probability. And I can understand that in some discussions of philosophy of religion, the two are kind of the same, especially, I mean, if in epistemology, I know a lot of epistemologists do think that credence or probability are the same. But I don't think that probability, I don't think that's as settled, because I think if you adopt a non-subjective understanding of probability, in which probability is objective, or at least mind independent, then you would have to say that Pascal's wagers leaves us with some religion that we possibly cannot factor in within our little decision box or decision matrix, because its probabilities are mind independent, and we may as well have gods that maybe we haven't thought of, since this is not talking about credence but probability, that is about the external world. And yet, if you were to take the interpretation that it's credence and not probability that matters, then I also think you end up with kind of a weird or kind of an odd implication, where Pascal's wager is highly relative to everybody, to every single person, because credence, as far as I understand it in philosophy, is just the degree, your confidence, the degree of your confidence in the truth of a proposition. So how confident you are in what you know, from what you know, in how true that proposition is. So the credence of me believing that this apple tastes so good isn't necessarily true for everybody, because everyone thinks differently about the same apple or the taste of it. But I might be very confident in it, and that's my credence. And so then I think if you were to use credence, then it would lead to maybe perhaps a slightly odd understanding, where Pascal's wager is true depending on what you know about the religions. And so I guess the first concern, and probably the only one that I'll bring up here, is just that I want to understand better. Do you prefer credence or probability, and do you think the concerns I have regarding either of those two words would actually hold in your opinion? And so maybe I can try to translate this first before you respond. So jadi aku tuh menemukan dalam papernya beliau gitu, Dr. Liz. Dr. Liz itu menggunakan
singkat aja John, anyway terjemahannya. Singkatin aja terjemahannya.
Oh iya. Jadi itu menggunakan maksudnya terjemahan Dr. Liz ya tadi ya.
Enggak terjemahan lu juga John. Jadi langsung to the point aja kayaknya.
Oh iya enggak apa. Jadi dalam paper Dr. Liz itu beliau menggunakan dua terminologi yang seringkali digunakan seakan mereka tentang konsep yang sama gitu, yaitu kata yang pertama credence gitu. Credence itu nggak ada terjemahan langsungnya dalam bahasa Indonesia. Mungkin aku sebut hanya kepercayaan diri kita terhadap kebenaran sebuah ini ya. Jadi kepercayaan diri kita itu credence. Jadi kalau aku bilang, kamu percaya nggak kalau misalnya musik band ini bagus gitu? Dan aku bilang, percaya dong gitu karena suka nih gitu. Nah itu kan pandangan kamu aja subjektif gitu. Nah itu credence. Satunya lagi adalah probability. Yaitu probability itu kan probabilitas itu seringkali suatu konsep yang tidak tergantung apa yang kita pikirkan gitu. Sedangkan credence adalah sesuatu yang bergantung dengan apa yang kita pikirkan. Jadi misalnya aku bilang probabilitas dari pesawat ini bisa sampai ke perjalanan dengan selamat. Itu kan sesuatu hal yang kamu tahu atau enggak pun enggak peduli, itu probabilitasnya tetap itu gitu. Nah, sedangkan dalam paper beliau seringkali menggunakan probability dan credence itu bersamaan gitu, dan seakan mereka artinya sama gitu. Sedangkan dalam filsafat agama kontemporer tidak semua menganggap probabilitas itu sama dengan credence. Karena apa? Karena banyak yang menganggap probabilitas itu tidak subjektif. Jadi contohnya, so I didn't mention this earlier to Dr. Liz, but I'm gonna mention it and then translate it again in Indonesia. I just wanted to say that I think in philosophy of religion, people like David Lewis, for example, would think that probability is not subjective. And jadi kalau misalnya kayak contohnya aja filsuf di agama sekarang yang sangat ngetren itu bernama David Lewis, itu nggak menganggap probabilitas itu subjektif, tapi objektif tentang sesuatu yang tentang dunia keluar kita yang tidak peduli apapun yang kita tahu mengenai dunia itu probabilitasnya sama gitu. Sehingga jika kita aplikasikan lagi kepada Pascal Schweitzer, bayangkan kalau misalnya Pascal Schweitzer ini tentang credence gitu dan bukan probabilitas, maka Pascal Schweitzer itu menjadi sesuatu yang sangat subjektif gitu ya. Dalam arti Pascal Schweitzer buat aku dan kamu itu akan memiliki nilai yang berbeda gitu. Mungkin buat kamu karena kamu tahu banyak tentang agama Kristen, berdasarkan taruhan Pascal, nilai probabilitas kebenaran Pascal Schweitzer ini akan jadi sangat tinggi gitu. Karena kamu tahu lebih banyak tentang Kristen daripada aku. Nah, tapi misalnya aku tahu tentang agama lain gitu. Nah, kalau gitu artinya Pascal Schweitzer pertaruhan yang sama, argumen yang sama, buat kita berdua itu kesimpulannya bisa beda dong. Gitu. Karena kita menganggap credence itu, probabilitas adalah credence yang subjektif, yang berdasarkan apa yang kita tahu dan penilaian subjektif kita. Nah, bayangkan kalau sisinya satunya lagi, kalau misalnya probabilitas adalah sesuatu yang tidak subjektif, seperti kata filsuf sains kayak Popper dan Karl Popper dan David Lewis juga gitu. Maka dalam pandangan ini artinya bisa aja dong kamu susah-susah bikin memikirkan apakah Tuhanmu itu patut dipertaruhkan atau tidak, tetapi ternyata ada Tuhan lain yang kamu nggak sadar itu ternyata memiliki probabilitas yang sangat tinggi gitu. Bisa aja gitu anggapan. Jadi menurutku kita ada dua kali kata terminologi yaitu credence dan probability yang memiliki implikasi yang sangat berbeda gitu. Tapi dalam paper beliau, terkadang aku melihat beliau seringkali menggunakannya bersamaan gitu. Jadi aku penasaran aja pendapat beliau gitu. Yang mana gitu, credence atau probability gitu. So I'm just done translating, Dr. Liz. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, first, thank you so much, and very great question, awesome question. And I'll say too, I didn't want to. I guess I didn't know like how people would feel about the math, and some people don't like the math, so I didn't go into the math as much. But I'm really glad you brought that up because that is an important part of the paper, and I think an important thing that a lot of people in philosophy of religion don't realize. They just try to multiply by infinities. This is actually the whole basis of the mixed strategies objection. And we're just like, this doesn't work. Like, what are you doing? So we similarly had a similar reaction and found that frustrating. And I'm glad we have a mathematician's approval. So, yeah. So I guess
that was my first reaction too. I was very confused.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think it's a great question about types of probabilities. I mean, like, super interesting issue just in and of itself. Like, what is the right interpretation of probability, or like when should we use different interpretations, like in what contexts? And so yeah, I do think we do use both of those words, and we maybe should have like been clearer about this, but at least for the purposes of this paper, we do really want to go subjective. So we want to make it in terms of credences, and this will have the result you're talking about. It will really be person relative, like what each person should wager on. And again, like, I sort of say this rule of thumb, which is like, in a lot of cases, in most cases, you should wager on the religion that you think is most likely to be true, but that's not always gonna hold, depending on if someone's super convinced by Homer Simpson, or, you know, there's various other scenarios that you can spell out where that won't hold, but it's going to hold, I think, for a lot of people's credences. But yeah, you're totally right. There is a very large subjective element to this. And part of the reason for that is because we just didn't have a space to try to make arguments about which religions are more probable and which religions aren't. And, you know, that wasn't, I think, you know, the way I see things, that's not really what Pascal's wager is trying to do. Like, when you get to the point where you're arguing about religions or giving evidence for and against certain religions, you're not really doing Pascal's wager anymore. You're doing like theology or arguments for God's existence or something else. So it's not a pragmatic thing anymore. So I think we do leave it open. You could try to combine our argument with some kind of evidence, and then, you know, try to make it more about something that's more of an objective probability. But we really do want to keep it subjective. And I agree that will make it highly relative to every person. And yeah, there is some things that are not desirable about that, but I think just kind of like given our constraints, and also just given that I think that is the way a lot of decision theorists think about probability, they use subjective probability as their interpretation. We were kind of wanting to you know, stay in step with that. And people have been like, you're such a postmodernist. Like, they'll like throw out all these words, and you're just like, no, I think you just don't understand like the way decision theory works in most cases. But I do agree that it is weird how subjective it is. And that's not the most desirable way, but I think that is kind of the best way to go given the situation. So hopefully that answers your question. It's a really good question.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. San, do you want to translate, or should I translate what she replied?
No, please, John, translate it.
Oh ya, jadi jawaban Dr. Liz itu yang pertama adalah ternyata memang bagi Dr. Liz yang Dr. Liz maksud itu adalah credence gitu, atau probabilitas itu sebenarnya subjektif, bergantung pada orang masing-masing gitu. Nah, tentunya ini lalu ada implikasi gitu, bahwa nggak bagi semua orang itu probabilitas untuk agama yang sama itu akan memiliki outcome yang sama, atau akan memiliki pilihan yang sama berdasarkan Pascal's wager. Jadi tentunya orang yang berbeda dengan pengetahuan yang berbeda akan memiliki pertaruhan yang berbeda karena apa yang mereka tahu berbeda. Tetapi kata Dr. Liz tadi, karena memang dalam paper tersebut nggak ada dua alasan sih yang Dr. Liz bilang. Yang pertama adalah dalam paper tersebut memang nggak cukup untuk kita harus bisa memikirkan satu-satu antara agama yang mana gitu. Jadi pandangan subjektif ini akan membantu kita untuk memudahkan pengertian kita terhadap Pascal wager. Yang kedua, memang dalam teori ekonomi gitu, yang disebut probabilitas dan risk gitu, itu seringkali tidak membedakan antara yang objektif dan yang subjektif gitu. Sehingga mengikuti konvension aja ya, bagi Dr. Liz itu mengikuti kebiasaan dalam ekonomi, maka itu lebih memilih yang subjektif gitu, probabilitas adalah subjektif. So thank you so much though, Dr. Liz. I really appreciate that though. I think it still holds like I still think that Pascal's wager still holds its value even when it has that subjective element. But I do wonder though. So you are right in one sense that also, I find it very interesting if Pascal's wager were is person relative, because in a way too, we can choose to increase the credence of a particular religion that we're considering, right? I don't know. This is just like a fun thought that I have. I don't mean to criticize. I guess just as a fun question. Do you think? How do you consider this maybe perhaps implication that we can then choose to increase the credence? Because, for example, like a regular atheist, they don't believe in God, and the reason why they don't is because all they watch is Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, and that's all they want to watch, right? And so I guess then they're technically using their Pascal's wager as well to claim that, the credence of God is very, very low because, gosh, I've never read anything about them, and so in one sense, but there is always a choice to increase the credence for God by opening up your reading and stuff. And so in a very interesting sense, I guess everyone is not maybe everybody, but even atheists are using Pascal's wager, but then it's reversing it, or perhaps voluntarily lowering their credence for religion. So this is just my thought, right? Are atheists also using Pascal's wager in a sense? And how do you consider, our choice? Do we have to consider as well our choice that we can increase the credence of perhaps any particular religion, just by way of a fun question? Jadi, and maybe if I can translate first. Jadi,
John, nanti aja. Kayaknya biar
Oh, iya.
Dr. Lis jawab dulu. Aku yang translate aja nanti. Ya, kasihan Dr. Lis. Please continue, Dr. Lis.
You translated it already? It's good?
No, after you answer it, I'll translate.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see. Okay, cool. I was like, that was so fast. Yeah, no, it's a fun question. It's really funny. So, I mean, in some ways, you could think of Pascal's wager, you could think of it sort of like the ontological argument. I don't know if you are familiar with the ontological argument, but it basically tries to conclude from the idea that God is possible, that God is actual, And a lot of people, before they hear the argument, they'll say, oh yeah, God is possible, at least. I'm an atheist, but like God could exist, And then they're taken through these steps of the ontological argument, and then they're like, oh man, then if that shows that God is actual, maybe God really isn't possible, And I'm not saying everyone's going to respond this way, but one kind of, you could think that maybe someone would have a similar reaction to Pascal's wager, where they would say, well, there's maybe a tiny chance that some of the major world religions are true. And then once they kind of encounter Pascal's wager, maybe what they do is they say, just kidding, and then they like lower their credence to zero. And yeah, I mean, that is definitely a way that one could respond to the wager. I guess it's not totally clear to me that someone that literally assigns a credence of zero to like all major world religions or to God's existence is taking the wager, but they are kind of like being rational, I guess, like maybe given the things we've said in the paper, so that is definitely a way to get around it. I will say this though, on a lot of models of decision theory, the credence is, the probability is subjective probability, but those credences still have to meet certain constraints. So you can't just put any credence in no matter what. If you assign a credence of 1 to P and a credence of 1 to not P, I mean, your decision table is just going to start looking really weird if you have all these like incoherent credences. And some people think that the only cases where you should assign credence of 0 or credence of 1 to certain claims is if they're either necessarily true or necessarily false. So necessarily true would be 1, and then necessarily false would be 0. And so I think what's important to note about the atheist that lowers their credence to 0 or has a credence of 0 or whatever is just that they are technically violating this axiom of probability. And some epistemologists even go further and say you actually shouldn't assign any claims, probability 1 or 0. Even, 1 plus 1 equals 2, well, Descartes said we could be wrong about the truths of math and logic, even your own existence. Well, Hume said, how do you know you exist? And there's not just like a thought or a desire. Like, why do you think there's a self, So almost anything you would say, I'm 100% certain of, you can kind of question, similar with 0. And so the downside of just assigning all religions credence 0 is you do have to violate, I think, what is commonly taken to be a constraint on rational credences. And again, credences are subjective, but I think a lot of people think that doesn't mean that anything goes. You have to at least meet some minimal, coherence constraints, including this idea that, there's only certain things you should assign credence 1 and credence 0 to. But that said, I'm super interested in these questions. I'm also really interested, one thing you kind of alluded to is whether we could like increase or change our credences at will. Super interesting question, actually kind of underexplored. I think a lot of people would say no, but I'm really open to the possibility that we maybe could. So that's, I've been working on some papers on that too. So there's a lot more to be said here, but I've already given you a lot to translate. So maybe I'll stop there.
Okay. So yeah, I guess John maybe want to respond, but it's already past 30 minutes. Yeah, we don't want to make you too tired to talk about Pascal's wager.
Thank you so much, though.
Please let me translate it first.
Yeah, I really
aku translate dulu ya, John.
Yeah.
Oke, jadi teman-teman pertanyaan John singkatnya begini. Bagaimana kalau kan tadi kan credence atau pengakuan kali ya, atau kepercayaan diri kita terhadap suatu kepercayaan itu subjektif. Bagaimana kalau seandainya seorang ateis merendahkan credence mereka terhadap teisme, gitu ya John, kayaknya kurang lebih ya, terhadap keberadaan Tuhan. Ya, itu pertanyaan. Jadi mereka menggunakan Pascal wager juga, jangan-jangan nih orang-orang ateis. Ya, statementnya Dr. Liz mungkin aja bisa, gitu ya. Mungkin aja mereka melakukan hal tersebut, tapi mereka sedang melakukan sebuah pelanggaran. Nah, John, gue nggak terlalu ngerti bagian pelanggaran itu. Maksudnya gue nggak bisa translate-nya. Lu bisa, kamu bisa bantu translate soal what they violate, ya sih?
Kenapa? Sorry, Sam.
Apa yang di-violate sama para ateis tersebut? Tadi aku kurang nangkep.
Oh iya. Jadi probability itu kan nggak tentu zero gitu loh, Sam. Sedangkan kalau kamu, maksudnya walaupun lu ateis dan lu ini, tapi lu nggak bisa benar-benar sampai membuat probability itu rendah banget gitu loh.
Oke. Ya, bisa lanjutin John, kalau ada yang mau dilanjutin.
Jadi maksudnya kayak baseline itu semua orang memiliki probabilitas yang ya kira-kira setara untuk bisa membuat Pascal wager ini bekerja gitu loh, Sam, gitu. Jadi maksudnya sebisa benar membuat diri lu credence Tuhan itu sampai nol banget, tapi namanya sampai manfaat yang didapat itu sangat lebih rendah dari ateis gitu kan.
Ya. Oke. Sepertinya begitu ya, teman-teman ya. Aku mau lanjutin pertanyaan lagi nih, dan ada yang nanya beberapa nih. Tapi ya, udah lewat 30 menit nih. Kasian banget juga ya, Dr. Liz dan John nih, malam-malam Ronto ngomongin Pascal wager. Jadi kayaknya kita bakal akhirin, teman-teman. So, Dr. Liz, thank you so much. Yeah. Already past 30 minutes from what we asked you, 45 until 60 minutes. So, we're really sorry for the overdue.
It's my fault because I talk so much. Sorry, I'm so long-winded.
But it's really interesting. I love to talk about Pascal wager, and yeah, I think I'll read other papers from you on Pascal's wager. John, you have anything to add?
Oh, sorry. I was no. I think it's all good.
Okay,
can I just say, thanks so much for both of you for your questions. It's really good. And thank you so much for having me on. It was a really fun discussion. So thank you.
Thank you so much as well, Dr. Liz.
Thank you so much. Okay, so that's it, friends. I hope it gives you some insights on your religiosity, on your, I don't know, maybe your understanding of your religious belief and other things about that. Mudah-mudahan teman-teman bisa dapat something yang insightful dan bisa merefleksikan lebih lagi soal kepercayaan teman-teman. Interestingly, right now in Indonesia, we're on Ramadan. We're on Ramadan. Some of them are fasting, so maybe this thing our discussions might make us more reflective about the Ramadan and so on. So thank you, Dr. Liz. It is really a pleasure to have you here. I hope there's another time for us to talk with you. So I think
that would be great. Thank you again. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Liz. So maybe I'll